Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras, a changing America. I'm Simon Thompson. In our border region, immigrants and asylum seekers face a broad and unaccountable mechanism of discretion used by Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Border Patrol. The practice can leave immigrants in prolonged detention, separate families, and denies justice to those fleeing violence and persecution. That's according to a recent report released by the Hope Border Institute. We'll speak to the director, Dylan Corbett, about the report. But first, let's take a closer look at issues and obstacles and the dangers of migration along our southern border. Honduran refugees visited the borderlands to raise awareness about the dangers involved to coming to the US. Central American refugees say building a border wall and boosted enforcement along the southern border is not going to deter migrants. Fronteras project reporter Jean Guerrero has the story.
If
30-year-old Honduran refugee Jose Luis Hernandez had his way, his fellow Central Americans would stop migrating to the U.S. He discussed this desire with 3 other dismembered migrants at a press conference held at San Diego's nonprofit Border Angels.
Build a wall.
In a way, he's like millions of Americans concerned about illegal immigration, who support proposals to build a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. But Hernandez thinks the U.S. has failed to stop illegal immigration so far because it has failed to understand what motivates people like him.
The American dream does not exist. What exists is a need. It's a forced migration.
When he tried to reach the U.S. on the roof of an infamous Mexican train known as La Bestia, he fainted from hunger and exhaustion and got caught beneath the wheels.
I looked at my trapped leg. I tried to take it out with my arm. And the train also tore off my arm.
Hernandez returned to Honduras, where he formed the Association for Returned Migrants with Disabilities, which educates people about the dangers of migrating. The association has documented more than 700 Hondurans mutilated by the train, and nearly 400 killed in the last 6 years alone. But migrants keep coming.
Migration will stop only when our countries truly generate employment opportunities with fair wages.
Hernandez is visiting the U.S. with the hope of speaking with President Obama. He thinks only the U.S. can convince the Honduran government to enact healthy economic policies that will decrease violence and stop Hondurans from risking their lives to reach the U.S.
Central American countries, whether we want it or not, are puppets of the United States. They dance to the rhythm of whatever music this country plays.
He says the current U.S. strategy of sending money for Mexican customs to boost enforcement along the southern border is only increasing injuries and fatalities by forcing his countrymen onto more dangerous routes. He says more customs officials and longer fences won't deter migrants for the same reason dismemberment doesn't deter them. Because for them, it's currently a matter of life and death. Jean Guerrero, KPBS News.
We're now joined by Dylan Corbett, the director of the Hope Border Institute. Dylan, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here, thank you.
So could you tell us about how this broad discretion the Department of Homeland Security agencies has in their interactions with immigrants and asylum seekers and what problems it causes?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to understand, a lot of people don't know that we have a real huge federal government complex in terms of immigration and border enforcement here on the border that you wouldn't see in other parts of the country like Kansas or New York City or Washington, D.C. So there are a number of overlapping agencies and organizations like Customs and Border Patrol, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, a whole network of immigration courts and immigration detention centers. And so there are a lot of people who work in each of those agencies and in that different network. Agents, officers, officials, judges. And at each step of the immigration process, these agents have a lot of power to decide over the fate of people's lives.
Whether or discretion in this case.
Exactly,
okay.
Discretion. So that power would be discretion, whether people are deported, whether the government decides to remove someone or separate a family, or put an immigrant in a detention center, or put an asylum seeker in detention center. A lot of people don't know, because America has had such a strong commitment to asylum seekers, to refugees around the world, that often what we're doing right now is just putting them in detention centers. So that power, that discretion is really consequential in people's lives. And with the report that we did, Discretion to Deny, we hope to sort of lift the hood on that complicated maze of discretion and explain exactly what's going on.
And a complicated maze, that's not a bad analogy for the immigration system in the US. Isn't discretion for these different agencies and officers a good thing? You know, there are so many different overlapping, complicated aspects to each immigration case. Don't these agencies need discretion to be able to determine the best scenario in these cases?
Exactly. Discretion should be a good thing. In all aspects of law, jurisprudence, law enforcement in the United States, there's discretion. How do we apply the law? How do we allocate resources in an intelligent way? We're a country of laws, so we believe that the law should be enforced rationally, humanely, in accordance with our values, in a way that best uses limited resources. But what we've seen here in our border communities here in southern New Mexico and in El Paso is that discretion is being more and more used to deport folks, to separate families who've lived here for a long time, to put asylum seekers into detention. And it's being used in a way that doesn't really reflect our values as Americans.
Interesting. So, you know, could you kind of speak to, you've done this report, and from what I can tell, you've analysed 100 documented cases within our region. Could you speak to some of the misuse in your mind of this discretion and kind of what the impacts and problems that it can happen with it?
Yeah, part of the broken immigration system is that we have these really massive agencies who are operating with a significant amount of discretion, but they're really not transparent. They're not accountable. So it's hard to know exactly what they're doing. They don't publish a lot of the numbers. The facts aren't clear. But what had started to happen in the last couple of years is that a number of attorneys, including agencies which provide legal services at low cost for the immigrant community, for example, Catholic Charities here in Las Cruces, or Diocesan Migrant and Refugee Services in El Paso, attorneys had started to see that there were more deportations, that there was more immigrant detention, that the detention was longer, and that asylum seekers who were coming to our border were facing a greater gamut of obstacles. So because of the lack of transparency, we decided to put together a report, and we looked at over 100 cases. We interviewed dozens of attorneys who participated in this from across our border community. And it began to paint a picture that was really disturbing. It had appeared that in the last just couple of years, especially since the arrival of a new Immigrations and Customs Enforcement field director here, who came from a different part of the country, that there was a ramping up of that immigration enforcement. And it began to impact families here. So we wanted to document it, and so we did document it. What we saw is that more and more families are being separated, that asylum seekers, there are more and more obstacles being put up to asylum seekers who come to our border. For example, family separation is one of the obstacles. Many people who come to our border from Mexico or Central America fleeing the violence and the political and economic instability there come as families. But often what Immigration and Customs Enforcement, what CBP, Customs and Border Protection is doing is separating those families when they come.
So could you kind of give me an example of a case where, you know, because this discretion was maybe abused in your mind, or, you know, used a way against the immigrant's favor, how it can actually change the fate of someone and a family in the US?
Yeah, so just a couple of cases about asylum seekers. There was a young lady whose story is detailed in the report, Discretion to Deny, who came over from Juarez, fleeing some really serious violence and corruption. She was virtually kidnapped and put in a prison with the complicity of the prison authorities by a mid-level cartel member who threatened her life and threatened the lives of her family. So she came over with her infant son, who was breastfeeding at the time, and applied for asylum status, which is perfectly legal. There's nothing illegal about that. And the U.S., as I said, is a country which has a historical commitment to receiving refugees, people who are fleeing violence and persecution. instead of receiving her with dignity, what we did as a country was to put her in an immigrant detention center, which is effectively jail. And she was there for 8 months. And during those 8 months, she was separated from her infant child. And those are 8 months that she'll never get back. She was finally released, and she's in the community now. She's safe. But that was a decision.
In the U.S. community or the Mexico?
In the U.S. community,
Okay.
here on this side of the border. And that was a decision that simply didn't have to be made. Again, discretion. She was put in a detention center. There's nothing that didn't have to happen. A more recent example, this week, a couple months ago, Martin Pineda, who was a reporter who came to our border fleeing violence in Mexico, a reporter in Acapulco. He had been beaten by government authorities, by police. His life had been threatened for reporting against the government, and he came to our border. Now, we know Mexico is the most dangerous country in the world right now for journalists. You know this. And again, rather than receiving him and treating him with dignity, we have put him in detention. He came over 2 months ago. He's been in detention since then, and his request to be released into the community before he can see a judge to make his case has been denied. So he's in detention right now, effectively jail, and he could be there for several months. A quarter of the cases that we looked at in terms of asylum seekers, folks fleeing violence and persecution who came to our border, were put in detention for over 6 months, some up to 2 years. So this is something that's getting worse. It's more
So people who end up being eligible for asylum and being able to live in the US and end up being eligible for permanent residency are unnecessarily getting thrown in detention.
Yeah, and what that does, I think it's important to say, is it discourages asylum seekers.
Could you speak to, do you think this discretion is being used in a way to deter people from coming?
I do, because what we've seen in the report is that at all points during the trajectory of looking for asylum, from people coming to the border to being put into detention to seeing an immigration judge, there are obstacles which are put up. We heard of folks coming to the border and being told, we don't have any more asylum slots for you, which is completely untrue. They're supposed to be given a credible fear interview, and once they pass the interview, they're permitted to come into the United States and make their asylum claim. During the interview, we were told by a lot of immigrants that they were badgered. It wasn't an interview, it was an interrogation. They were harassed. There was mental abuse, sometimes physical abuse, threats. Things are not supposed to happen. So between those threats, between the lies and the intimidation that happened, between putting people in detention, in many cases, being separated from their children, in many cases, folks who came to seek asylum simply gave up. One of them told us, I had to choose between my life and my liberty. And that's not a choice that anyone should have to make. And that's why it's so important to spotlight what's actually going on our border.
Obviously, you're focused on what's happening here in the border region, but in terms of where does the Hope Border Institute stand on what would be appropriate way for the U.S. government to deter people from coming or to stop the flow of migrants who don't have traditional paperwork?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to say that we shouldn't be deterring asylum seekers at all. Folks who are fleeing violence and persecution, religious persecution, they have a right under international and federal law to come to our border. They're often referred to in the media as illegal immigrants. A lot of the people who are coming right now, who are arriving to the southern Texas border, for example, from Central America, really are refugees. The UN recently did a study and saw that looking at a group of folks who don't have access to attorneys, some of the mothers and children coming to the border right now, it determined that over 80% would qualify for asylum. So these aren't illegal immigrants in the sense that they're crossing the border illegally. We shouldn't be deterring them at all. In order to address the broader phenomenon of migration and unauthorized migration, we need to be addressing the root causes of that. Things like building a wall, things like increased enforcement, things like adding additional agents to Border Patrol and ICE, which President Trump has proposed, those don't address the root causes. Those root causes are economic, they're political, and they also have to do with our consumption of drugs. A lot of these countries, a lot of the people who are coming to our southern border right now, are coming from countries that are destabilized as a result of drug trafficking and the drug war. And no wall is going to stop that. So this lack of stability in these countries that can't guarantee security for their populations, in large part this is due to U.S. consumption of drugs. So we're implicated in this, and we have to go deeper than just enforcement and look at root causes of poverty and violence.
Interesting. So the report that you conducted, or the Hope Border Institute conducted, was finalized before Donald Trump became president. Could you kind of speak to, has anything changed in our region, and anything that you kind of documented in this that has maybe gotten better, maybe has gotten more troublesome for you guys?
Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of the things that we highlight in the report, the increased deportations, the increased detention of migrants, many of whom are detained in private immigrant detention centers. There are private companies who are making money off this, so there's a profit motive. The separation of families and the deterrence of asylum seekers. Unfortunately, since the Trump administration, a lot of these things which were abuses under the old system have now become mainstream and are now sort of the policy of the administration. So 5 days after President Trump was inaugurated on January 25th, he signed 2 executive orders which had to do with immigration issues that affect our community. One on immigration enforcement and one on border enforcement. Those are the executive orders that talk about building a wall or adding 15,000 additional immigration enforcement agents. They talk about enhanced interviews for asylum seekers. They talk about the fact that we should be deporting everybody basically who's unauthorized. It sort of takes it sets priorities which are so broad as to be virtually meaningless.
Have you seen a tangible change? You know, more people, more different actions, different things, behaviors from these federal organizations, more families getting separated, or is it kind of too early to make that judgment call?
I think we have seen a change because we saw across the country, but also here in Las Cruces and in parts of El Paso County, increased enforcement by ICE. Raids, we hadn't seen raids for a long time. That's, that certainly represents that this is a new chapter in immigration enforcement. The case of Martin Pineda, who was denied parole to be released from a detention center, the Mexican reporter, that I think reflects that this is a new chapter, that now not only are we criminalizing migrants, but we're criminalizing asylum seekers. So this is a trend that really has become policy under Trump with the new executive orders. It's troubling, it's alarming, but I also think it's important to note that this trend towards the criminalization of migrants and the militarization of our border has been going on for several decades under Republicans and Democrats. It's been enabled by Congress and the president. So while it represents a new chapter, I think it's really the consolidation of this long trend towards criminalizing immigrants.
It's headed in the same direction that it always has been.
Exactly.
But maybe at a faster rate. So, you know, you point out allege a lot of problems, you know, families being separated, you know, intentional and systematic deterrence of people who are valid asylum seekers, you know, lack of accountability, you know, very little justification for actions these federal organizations and agents and representatives are taking. You know, what changes are you and the report trying to advocate and that are realistic?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's really no reason to use immigrant detention for asylum seekers. We need to end that. We need to end immigrant detention in general, unless there's a real cause in order to protect our community's security.
What would be the alternative to that? Because I just don't think the average person has a concept of what that would look like.
There's no reason to detain migrants. I mean, that's simply unnecessary. The detention of migrants, the detention of asylum seekers, for example, is something that we didn't do up until, you know, a decade or two ago. That wasn't something that the United States did. I think it's this broader trend towards criminalization. There's also, as I said, a profit motive. The biggest detention centers in the United States right now for immigrant detention are private, so there are a lot of private interests involved. For example, we have what's called a congressional bed mandate in this country. Every night in this country, 34,000 beds are occupied by migrants. And so many times when authorities are exercising their discretion, and we know this from the report and from other reports, many times local immigration authorities make their decisions on whether to detain someone or not, to detain a family or not, based on whether there's bed space available. And so if the government's paying over $100 every night over $100 every night to detain a migrant, and much of that money is going to private companies. I think it's incumbent upon us to ask some serious questions as to, is this really something that reflects our values as Americans? The Obama administration made some decisions to stop using private companies as federal prisons. They had explored the option of eliminating federal detention centers for migrants. The Trump administration has backtracked on that, but there's really no reason to have private companies doing this type of business, making money off of people's lives.
Interesting. What other changes would you like to see in terms of, this whole process? There seems like you're alleging a lot, and what would be the means of changing it too?
The real solution, the only lasting solution, is to have permanent, comprehensive immigration reform. If you look at the unauthorized population in the United States right now, 3/5 of the unauthorized population has been here for a decade or more. There are over 4 million children in the country right now, U.S. citizen children, who have at least one unauthorized parent. There are over 1 million children who themselves are unauthorized. To increase immigration enforcement, to build a wall on the border, this really doesn't solve the problem. Criminalizing people doesn't solve the problem. What we need to do is regularize that situation, and also look at the benefits that the immigrants bring to our communities. They contribute to our country economically. Border towns are safer than other towns in the United States, in large part due to the presence of immigrants. They contribute to taxes, they pay for Social Security, they keep our Social Security Trust Fund alive in many respects. They have mortgages, they serve in the armed forces, they go to school, they study in our universities here locally. These are people who are part of our community. And rather than criminalizing them or looking at deportation as the solution, we need to look at the root causes of what's driving immigration abroad, and also figure out a way to fix a broken system.
Interesting. And what would you say to people that are concerned and do think that there should be, people should be deterred or should be focused on resolving the issues that are bringing them here in their own countries in the first place?
I would say this, that we are a country of law and order, and so we should have a regular system of immigration. The fact is, right now we don't. People on the left, people on the right, Democrats and Republicans, we can all agree that what we have right now is not an orderly system, that it's a broken system, that it's not a system that promotes law and order, it's not a system which promotes human dignity. I think we all want that. So we need to fix the system. And I would say, as you said, it's important to look at the root causes of what's driving it. We're involved economically in these countries. Our economic policies that we pursued through free trade agreements like NAFTA in Mexico or CAFTA in Central America, policies like the drug war, these are driving the violence and the political instability which are causing migration in the first place. So if we address the root causes, and if we continue to sustain our commitment to refugees as we have as a country for our history as the United States, and if we commit to fixing a broken system, I think those are things that all Americans, wherever they stand on the political spectrum, can come around and agree on.
So there's a lot of, as you said, there's a lot of critiques of the US immigration system on both sides of politics. But I come from Australia, and we have an immigration system that's even less sympathetic to asylum seekers and migrants. Is there a country that has an immigration system that could be a model for other countries and the US?
Well, I think on the whole, if you look at the world right now, the immigration crisis in the United States sort of pales in comparison to what's going on, as you say, on the international level. Because the unauthorized population in the United States right now is actually at a historic low. Immigration from Mexico is actually negative. More people are going back than are coming. And those who are coming are those who are coming because of extreme situations of violence and poverty in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. But if you look at immigration on a world scale, what we're seeing is really unparalleled. We haven't seen immigration like this in the history of humanity. Since we started documenting these numbers around World War II, we're at record levels right now. But if you look at what's driving that, if you look at the ordinary migrant who's going to a place like Australia or coming to the US, these aren't people who are searching just for a better life. These are people who are searching just for bare life. They're fleeing extreme poverty, they're fleeing war and in places like Syria, in places like Northern Africa, in Libya. These are people who are just looking for bare existence. We don't have the international and national framework to address this crisis. What we need to do is spotlight these broken systems and come up with a system that prioritizes human dignity and the unity of families, a system that prioritizes the best of our values as a national community and as a world community.
Very interesting. Dylan Corbett, thank you for joining us on Fronteras are Changing America, the Hope Border Institute Director. I'm Simon Thompson, and thank you for joining us on Fronteras are Changing America.